Brian Czech is the founding president of the Center for the Advancement of Steady State Economics. I probably got that a little bit wrong, but that's the thrust of it. He has a Ph.D. from the University of Arizona, and he's the author of several books on economics and the environment. That, to my mind, economics is a huge driver in our current situation. And the dominant form of economics that we've all either learned directly or indirectly is that growth is absolutely imperative to the well-being of everyone, especially the poor, but the middle class and the super rich. So the idea of a steady state economy is very much out of the mainstream. And we're fortunate to have Brian here to explain to us what a steady state economy would look like and how it would impact the environmental, how it would impact climate change. And so, Brian.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And that Dave McCain and Katie Pierce have been making me hungry for about the past half hour. It's 8:30 my time. But, all right. Yeah, I'm with the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. And I'm with them. I established the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy in 2003 because in my earlier career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I was prohibited from even talking about the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. And that's hard to deal with, that kind of censorship. So I established CASI, and finally I quit the government in 2017 to run CASI full time. So I want to share some slides also. And let me know if you can see that. Hopefully you see the, okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'll touch on the steady state economy, and then I'd like to talk about something that we call at CASI. CASI is the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, that we call the trophic theory of money, and then talk a little bit about GDP as an indicator of environmental impact. So, you know, I think we all have a sense that there's some kind of issue with the economy getting too big and causing problems, biodiversity loss, climate change, of course, in an 85% fossil fuel economy, and many, many other problems. And you know, here's a very simple way of looking at it. It's a process of using up the stocks of natural capital, the woods, the water, soils, fisheries, and so on, and converting that into producer and consumer goods and services. And in the process, pursuant to the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law, there will be waste. There must be waste in the form of material and waste heat as well. Okay, so we know there's this problem with economic growth, and we have a pretty good sense then that perpetual growth is not sustainable. It exceeds the carrying capacity at some point. And on the other hand, neither is perpetual degrowth sustainable. And so that leaves our very simple definition of steady state economy. It's that sustainable level of economic activity. And that entails a stabilized population and per capita production and consumption of goods and services. But what exactly is on this y-axis when we're talking about the size of the economy? Oh yeah, and by the way, it's not going to be a flat line. It'd be fluctuating, hopefully not too wildly, and so on. But well, I want to focus more now on the y-axis because this is really a huge issue, a major controversy that has kind of split even the community of ecological economics. Can we reliably use GDP gross domestic product, as a measure of the biophysical size of that economy. And now we're going to bring in another point here, which is that GDP is put in monetary terms, of course. What if we then just talked about money as the entity on the y-axis? And so that's going to lead us into what we call the trophic theory of money. Now everybody knows that money is a means of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. And money in the economy exists as a stock and as a flow. The stock of money is called the money supply, and there are different kinds of money supplies. We're really concerned about the liquid forms of money, the base money, the notes and coins in circulation or at the central bank, and then the M1 money supply, so-called narrow money, which is the M0, plus demand deposits, checking accounts. It's just money in the real common sense of the term. Flows of money can range from the very macroeconomic, like GDP, to other types of flows like the cash flow index. But we are concerned here today with GDP as the big river of money, if you will. And GDP is the monetary value of all final goods and services produced annually within a country's borders. That's the most common application of it. But don't let this phrase monetary value trip you up. And I think it helps to remember what's called the fundamental identity of national income accounting, which is that production equals income equals expenditure. Those are the three methods for calculating our GDP, national income, as it's often called. But once again, it's not the production of anything or income or expenditure from or on anything. It's the production of final goods and services, the income derived from them, and the expenditure on those final goods and services. Now, that doesn't mean all the other stuff is irrelevant. All of the production of intermediate goods lead to the final goods, of course, but you can't be double counting. So that's why GDP accounts for the final goods and services. So this isn't GDP, pulling that's, pumping in the dollars or whatever all night long. That doesn't add up to GDP. Paying the wages of the casino floor worker, that does count for GDP. It's real economic activity. And similarly, like transactions in derivatives on the trading floor, that doesn't go into GDP. GDP is a reflection of the real economy. Now, Aristotle said, "He who thus considers things in their first growth and origin will obtain the clearest view of them." So I'd like us to obtain a really clear view of money by going to the origin. And, these are the most famous regions for the origins of money: Mesopotamia, Lydia, and ancient Greece, and China, where respectively shekels and coins of electrum. Electrum is a natural alloy of gold and silver, and copper coins in China, in particular the Yellow River Basin, China. That's where money originated. Now, I want to go even further into the origins of this money, and we can look at what we could call proto money, like the barley grains, most famously in Mesopotamia, oxen as one of the examples of proto money in Lydia, and cowrie shell as the top example in China. All right, now we're going back, searching for the origins of money. We got some proto money. Let's go back a little further yet. And we find something that is no coincidence. These are the same places that we recognize as famously as for the origins of agriculture, especially, once again, Mesopotamia, and then especially the Elbe River Basin. And Lydia is a little different. It's more a matter of food surplus, including agricultural activities and fishing and some other things. But the trophic theory of money, as we call it at Castle, is that money originates via the agricultural surplus that frees the hands for the division of labor unto the manufacturing and service sectors. Prior to that, there's no need for money. There's no concept of money. Their hands aren't free to even be exchanging with money. And we call it the trophic theory of money because we're applying principles of ecology to the economy now. And in the economy of nature, we know that the economic activity is based upon production. And production is literally so through the process of photosynthesis. Those the producers are plants. And with enough of that production, surplus production, you can have primary consumers that eat the plants. And then with enough of that primary consumption, you can have the secondary consumers consuming the primary consumers. And the service providers, frankly, you can get them into the basic trophic levels, but we want to acknowledge that there are things like, soil decomposers and nutrient cyclers and pollinators and scavengers and so on. But the real deal here is the trophic structure. The human economy has to follow the same basic rules. It has a trophic base of agricultural and extractive sectors upon which the manufacturing sectors operate from heaviest to lightest. And at this point in technological history, there are many sorts of service sectors as well. But none of them operate without this, and in particular, without this surplus at the base. So that's why we call it the trophic theory of money. No surplus down here, no money. So before there's any of this very light manufacturing that grades right into the information economy of the service sectors, before there's any of that, there's a lot of this, because tremendous amounts of energy and materials are lost as you proceed from one trophic level to the next. And we'll go through more examples very soon, but the primary corollary then of the trophic theory of money is that the quantity of money, remember the money supply, and GDP as the flow of money indicates the amount of agricultural surplus and related activity at the trophic base, and therefore the environmental impact of the economy.
Brian, you scared me a little bit when you said many examples. We're running short on time here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Their examples will be about
reminder,
1 second apiece.
Yeah, great.
Yep. So you see the environmental impact of that expanding trophic base. Now let's get away from the theory now and look at these are the examples, Mark. Agriculture, very intensive. Extracting groundwater of the Oglala Aquifer over Kansas with this pivot agriculture. And I'm not going to talk about these. I'd love to give the show where I talk a little bit about each one, but you know what I'm talking about. Intensive livestock production at the trophic base. Intensive forestry, timber harvesting at the trophic base. Mining, and the energy sector, of course. That's when you start getting to the heavy manufacturing with the examples lumped into one slide, and then the light manufacturing. All right, so you've seen the trophic structure, and that includes the so-called information economy, with the information going to serve all these other sectors in that trophic structure. Otherwise, it's of no use whatsoever to GDP. So what does all that have to do with GDP? Well, just ask the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Remember the fundamental identity of national income fund. Production equals income equals expenditure. So our economists and accountants at the BEA, they're not just counting the money in the circular flow between labor and capital. They are looking at the real production, the real economy, which has that trophic structure. They don't realize the trophic structure, but we do as ecologists and ecological economists. As for the money supply, just ask the Federal Reserve, because their job is to prevent this kind of thing from happening. This is a big part of their job. Either type of inflation. And frankly, I think we have a combination of both right now, with the Fed having sort of been politically forced and rightfully so early on with loose money policy in a COVID pandemic. But we've also had pretty much a reduction in real economic activity, some of which is coming back. So we got a real serious inflation problem. And we predicted this in February of 2020. Well, what the Fed and also in fiscal policy, what the central policy of the United States is balanced growth, pursuant to an antiquated 1978 law that amended the 1946 Employment Act. We're working on replacing this. That'll take a while. But yeah, at Federal Reserve, they're all about balanced growth. And we know now, because of the trophic structure of the economy, what that growth, balanced or not, results in environmental impact. So, we realize that you can only have so much GDP until you hit an environmental capacity. But here's the thing, with the trophic theory of money, we might as well just put it in these terms. By this, I mean carrying capacity. The level of GDP and the money supply, which is very closely related to GDP, that could be our measure of carrying capacity. It'll work fine. Now, there are some variables that affect that GDP environment relationship. Obviously, there is inflation. That's easy to account for. You simply, use consumer price index and you derive real money that is adjusted for inflation. Technological progress, it sounds kind of complicated at first, but it's really not, because it runs linked at the hip with GDP growth based upon current levels of technology. That's the short story. I'd like to give you the full talk on that sometime. Otherwise, you can read my book, Supply Shock. And then, of course, international trade. But these things are easy to account for. So we have a rock solid relationship. Statistically, we can show you stats someday of GDP and environmental impact. So here's our top policy recommendations. The steady state economy. Yeah, you don't have to investigate till the cows come home the level of entropic throughput. No, you can use GDP. In other words, we have our environmental GDP. It's inverse GDP. And finally, I'm almost to the end here, Mark. And this, I think I'm raising this next point because in the book you guys have been reading, you've read about a proposal evidently for carbon coins. I don't know, because there's a problem here that we call the Trophic Conundrum. And it goes like this. The reason we're even talking about the value of natural capital these days is because the supply of it has been shifting inward as we liquidate those stocks of it in the process of economic growth, right? Well, the problem is if we're going to try somehow to conserve natural capital and ecosystem services by foisting some type of market for it into the economy, that means we need more money to be spending it on those transactions in natural capital and ecosystem services. The problem is with the trophic origins of money, you get less natural capital all along, and therefore, you need more, but you have less. You need more money now for that new market, but in trying to generate that more money, you wind up with less stocks of natural capital. That's what we call the Trophic Conundrum. So the final two slides here now are, I'm just urging people to always ask with any transaction, what's the money going to be used for? Because if it's not going to be used for one of those productive activities that lead to final goods and services, it's not going to be accounted for at all. It doesn't contribute to the size of the economy. And then on the other side of that same coin, so to speak, you got to ask yourself, how does one come to afford any good or service? Like if it's an ecosystem service. Productive trophic activity had to occur to generate the money to purchase it. So it's kind of a prosaic way of expressing that trophic conundrum. And finally, we come to that carbon coin, and I say we should always ask ourselves these two questions. So if we're transacting in carbon coins, once again, how did we come to afford the good or service? And evidently, with the concept of a carbon coin, it's by not trophically engaging, we get a carbon coin for not doing some. All right, well, that's kind of odd, but maybe, but then what's the money going to be used for? Because all goods and services do trophically arise. The real economy has that trophic structure. So if you think you're gonna get additional goods and services, even with money that wasn't trophically, no, you're gonna pay your dues one way or the other.
Brian,
you're going to be into the teeth of the trophic conundrum or the nightmare of inflation. Take your choice.
This is great. You know, I want to. I'm glad you have that slide there with your website, and there are lots of interesting talks and Brian's books and the books of other people like Herman Daly and stuff listed on that site. So again, I just want to say just how important economics is to unscrambling the mess we've worked ourselves into.